Sag. Gunfire echoed through shattered radio frequencies, followed by ragged breathing. Medical commanders abandoned hope, declaring a trapped SEAL sniper an absolute lost cause in hostile territory. Yet her lone trauma nurse recognized the dying man's classified call sign. Breaking every military protocol, she walked straight into a kill zone. Dust and the metallic scent of blood hung heavy in the stifling air of Forward Operating Base Griffin. Located in a desolate, unforgiving valley near the jagged border mountains, the medical compound was less of a hospital and more of a desperate holding area for broken bodies. Trauma nurse Abigail Prescott scrubbed her hands raw over a tin basin, watching the pink-stained water spiral down the drain. It had been a brutal 72 hours. An insurgent offensive had pushed the base's medical capabilities to their absolute limits, leaving the staff exhausted and the supply closet dangerously bare. In the adjacent Tactical Operations Center, separated from the trauma bay only by a thin canvas wall and a row of reinforced sandbags, the heavy static of military comms suddenly spiked. The encrypted radio channeled a transmission that sent an immediate chill down Abigail's spine. It was a broken, desperate broadcast, punctuated by the unmistakable rhythmic popping of heavy machine gun fire in the background. Goliath Actual, this is Wraith 2-0. Taking heavy fire, pinned down at Grid. The voice broke into a harsh, rattling cough. Multiple hostiles advancing. I have her through and through to the right chest wall. Shattered femur. I can't stop the bleeding. Abigail froze, the coarse towel slipping from her damp hands. She stepped toward the canvas divider, straining to hear over the chaotic hum of the generators. Dr. Samuel Aris, the chief surgical officer, stepped out of the surgical tent, wiping sweat from his forehead with the back of his arm. He shook his head grimly as he listened to the overhead speakers broadcasting the sniper's plea. He's got a sucking chest wound and an arterial bleed, Dr. Da. Aris muttered to nobody in particular, his voice laced with the cold, clinical detachment required to survive in a war zone. With a shattered femur, the bone fragments are likely tearing into the femoral artery. He's going into hypovolemic shock. He has maybe 45 minutes before his heart stops. Captain David Ross, the base commander, leaned over the radio console. Wraith, this is Goliath Actual. We copy your distress. What is your precise grid? We're trying to spin up a medevac, but the Shamal is rolling in fast. Visibility is dropping to 0. Negative on the bird, Goliath, the voice crackled back, weaker this time. Anti-air batteries on the ridgeline. They'll chew a chopper to pieces. Grid is compromised. Tell command I'm at the Devil's Anvil. They know where it is. Wraith out. Captain Ross slammed his fist onto the map table. Devil's Anvil, that's not on any operational map. Does anyone know what the hell he's talking about? Abigail felt the air leave her lungs. Wraith, it wasn't just a random military call sign. It was Chief Petty Officer Nathan Miller. 3 years ago, Nathan Miller had stood in her family's living room in Seattle, dressed in his immaculate dress blues, holding a folded American flag. He had been the sniper who provided cover fire while Abigail's older brother Daniel was fatally wounded during a raid in Fallujah. Nathan had carried Daniel's body for 3 miles through enemy territory, just so her brother wouldn't be left behind. Before Nathan had left her house that rainy afternoon, he had looked Abigail in the eye and made a solemn vow. Your brother never left his team behind. And as long as I'm breathing, I'll never let a good person die alone in the dirt. Now Nathan was the one bleeding out in the dirt, and the Devil's Anvil wasn't a military code. It was a private joke between Nathan and her brother. Daniel used to drag Nathan on grueling, off-trail hikes in the Cascades, and they had nicknamed a particularly brutal, jagged rock formation the Devil's Anvil. Abigail knew exactly what Nathan was doing. He was using a personal cipher to communicate his location securely, knowing the enemy was likely monitoring the open frequencies. He was pinned down at the Jagged Rock Quarry 3 miles north of the FOB, a massive, abandoned Soviet excavation site that looked exactly like a blacksmith's anvil from a satellite view. Abigail burst through the canvas flaps into the Tactical Operations Center. "Captain Ross, I know where he is. The Devil's Anvil is the abandoned Soviet quarry, Grid Sector 7 Bravo. It's just past the riverbed." Ross turned, his brow furrowed in irritation. "Nurse Prescott, you need to return to the medical bay. This is a classified comms area." "Captain, you don't understand," Abigail bleated, stepping closer to the map table and pointing at a jagged contour line. "I know this man. He was my brother's spotter. He's using a personal reference because he knows his exact coordinates will bring artillery down on his own head. He's at the quarry." "Doctor." Aris followed her into the room, his face a mask of weary resignation. "Abigail, even if you're right, it doesn't matter. Look at the radar." He pointed to a glowing screen showing a massive red and yellow storm front consuming the valley. "A Category 4 sandstorm is hitting us in less than 20 minutes. The winds are already grounding the Blackhawks. Even if we could fly, the insurgent Daishiyake anti-air guns are tearing up the sky." "Then send a ground convoy," Abigail demanded, her voice rising in panic. "Send the quick reaction force." Captain Ross sighed heavily, the weight of command aging his face. "Prescott, it's 3 miles of open desert controlled by hostiles followed by a vertical climb into a quarry. It's a suicide mission. I cannot risk a 6-man squad and an armored vehicle for one heavily wounded operator who, according to your own chief surgeon, won't survive the next hour." Wraith knew the risks when he went outside the wire. "I am officially declaring him missing in action. Presumed KIA. No one leaves this base." The finality of the commander's words hung in the suffocating air of the TOC. Dr. Aris placed a gentle hand on Abigail's shoulder. "I'm sorry, Abby, truly, but he's already a ghost." Abigail shook off the doctor's hand, her chest heaving as she backed out of the command center. They were writing him off. They were going to let the man who brought her brother home bleed to death alone in the dark. Not today, she thought, her grief instantly hardening into a dangerous crystalline resolve. "I won't let you die alone, Nathan." The medical supply tent was cloaked in shadows, lit only by the flickering glow of a single halogen bulb. Abigail moved with practiced surgical precision, ignoring the trembling in her hands. She grabbed a tactical medical assault backpack and began stuffing it with everything necessary to cheat death. Quick clot combat gauze, Israeli bandages, a dozen bags of O-negative blood from the chilled cooler, tranexamic acid to prevent hemorrhaging, a chest tube kit, and a portable oxygen canister. She was committing a court-martial offense. Stealing classified medical supplies and preparing to go AWOL in a combat zone would end her career and likely land her in Leavenworth. But as she zipped the heavy bag shut, all she could see was Nathan's face the day he handed her that folded flag. Slipping out the back flap of the medical tent, Abigail was immediately hit by the howling vanguard of the sandstorm. The wind felt like coarse sandpaper against her exposed cheeks, the sky bruising into a terrifying bruised purple-brown. The base was locking down. Soldiers were securing loose equipment and barricading themselves in reinforced bunkers. Abigail darted behind a row of shipping containers, making her way toward the motor pool. She needed a vehicle, and she needed someone crazy enough to drive it. She found exactly who she was looking for beneath the raised hood of a heavily armored MRAP, mine-resistant ambush-protected vehicle. Staff Sergeant Elias Brody was a mountain of a man, covered in grease and desert dust. Brody was a legendary mechanic and a designated driver for the elite recon units, known for his utter fearlessness and his fierce loyalty to the SEAL teams. More importantly, Abigail knew that 6 months ago, Nathan Miller had dragged a wounded Brody out of a burning Humvee in Kandahar. "Sergeant Brody," Abigail shouted over the roaring wind. Brody slammed the heavy steel hood shut and wiped his hands on a greasy rag, looking down at the small nurse clutching a massive trauma bag. Prescott, what the hell are you doing out here? The Shimao is about to hit full force. Get to the bunkers." "I need your truck," Abigail said, her voice uncompromising. "And I need you to drive me to the Soviet quarry in Sector 7 Bravo." Brody stared at her as if she had lost her mind. "The quarry? That's deep in Indian country, Abby. Command just grounded all outbound traffic. The gate is sealed. Nathan Miller is bleeding out at that quarry right now," Abigail yelled, stepping into his personal space, her eyes blazing with fierce determination. He took her round to the chest and shattered his femur. "Ross won't send the QRF. Horace says he's a dead man. They're leaving him behind." Brody's expression shifted. The casual annoyance vanished, replaced by a cold, hardened stare. He looked at the heavy trauma bag in her hands, then out toward the northern gate, where the wall of blinding sand was rapidly swallowing the horizon. "Wraith is out there?" Brody asked quietly. "Yes, and he has less than 30 minutes. Brody didn't hesitate. He tossed the greasy rag aside and yanked open the heavy, armor-plated door of the MRAP. "Get in." "What about the gate?" Abigail asked, hoisting her heavy pack into the cab. "The gate guards are sheltering from the storm," Brody said, a dangerous smirk playing on his lips as he climbed into the driver's seat and fired up the massive diesel engine. It roared to life like an angry beast, and an MRAP weighs 14 tons. "A chain-link fence isn't going to stop us." Abigail strapped herself into the passenger seat, gripping the safety handles as the vehicle lurched forward. Brody killed the headlights, relying solely on his night vision goggles and the thermal imaging screen on the dashboard. They'd bypassed the main thoroughfare, tearing through the dirt paths of the FOB. As they approached the northern perimeter, the wind escalated into a deafening roar. Visibility was entirely gone, replaced by a swirling vortex of choking brown dust. But Brody didn't slow down. The massive front grille of the MRAP slammed into the reinforced chain-link gate, tearing the metal hinges out of their concrete foundations with a screeching groan. Alarms immediately blared behind them, faint over the howling wind. But it was too late. They were out. The desert was a chaotic void. The MRAP shook violently as crosswinds battered its armored sides. Brody navigated by memory and the sluggish GPS tracker, his eyes glued to the thermal screen. "If we hit an IED in this mess, nobody is coming to scrape us up," he muttered, white-knuckling the steering wheel. "Just keep driving," Abigail said, her hands desperately organizing her trauma kit in the dark cab. She was mentally rehearsing the procedures. Needle decompression first to relieve the pressure in his chest. Then a tourniquet on the leg. Pack the wound. Start the blood transfusion. "Hold on, Nathan." "Just hold on." Suddenly, the thermal screen flared white. "Contact front." Brody yelled. A barrage of heavy-caliber rounds slammed against the armored windshield, leaving terrifying spiderweb cracks in the thick ballistic glass. It drummed straight into a roaming insurgent patrol seeking shelter from the storm. Brody didn't swerve. He slammed his boot down on the accelerator. "Hold on." The 14-ton MRAP plowed directly through the makeshift barricade the insurgents had set up, the impact jolting Abigail hard against her harness. Sparks flew as metal scraped against metal, and the vehicle blasted through the ambush, swallowed instantly back into the blinding anonymity of the sandstorm. "They'll radio ahead," Brody grunted, checking his gauges. "The quarry is going to be crawling with hostiles by the time we get there." "Then we have to get to him first," Abigail replied, drawing a deep breath, terrified but entirely unbroken. 15 minutes later, the flat desert terrain suddenly began to incline sharply. The MRAP's engine strained as Brody forced the vehicle up a treacherous, rocky switchback. Through the swirling dust, the massive, imposing shadows of the Soviet quarry loomed above them like ancient, broken teeth. The Devil's Anvil. Brody slammed on the brakes, throwing the vehicle into park behind a massive boulder that shielded them from the worst of the wind. "We can't drive any further without tipping. We go on foot from here. He unslung his M4 rifle and handed Abigail a heavy sidearm. "You know how to use this." Abigail took the weapon, feeling its cold, heavy weight. "Point and pull." "Let's hope you don't have to," Brody said, pushing open his door into the howling tempest. "Stay right behind me. Keep your head down." Stepping out of the vehicle was like walking into a sandblaster. Abigail pulled her tactical goggles down and wrapped a scarf tightly over her mouth, immediately tasting the grit. She slung the heavy medical bag over her shoulders, the straps digging into her collarbones. They climbed the jagged rocks, moving blindly through the storm. The radio static hissed in Abigail's earpiece. She had stolen a comms unit from the TOC before she left. "Wraith. Wraith, if you can hear this, sound off," Abigail breathed into the mic. Nothing but static answered her. They reached a plateau overlooking the massive, excavated pit of the quarry. Down below, hidden somewhere in the labyrinth of rusting mining equipment and crumbling rock walls, was the sniper. But as Brody scanned the area through his thermal scope, he suddenly pulled Abigail down behind a rusted crane track. "We have a problem," Brody whispered harshly, pointing down into the basin. Through a momentary break in the swirling dust, Abigail saw them. 5 pickup trucks, armed with mounted heavy machine guns, were parked at the base of the quarry. Flashlights cut through the dust like yellow lasers. A search party of at least 20 heavily armed insurgents was sweeping the area, hunting the wounded American. And worse, they were walking directly toward a small shadowed alcove at the far end of the quarry, the exact spot where a faint, erratic heat signature was blowing on Brody's thermal screen. "They're going to find him before we do," Brody said, chambering around. "I can lay down suppressive fire, draw them away. But it's suicide, Abby. There's too many of them." Abigail looked at the heat signature on the screen, then at the heavily armed men closing in on it. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She had broken every rule, risked the court-martial, and driven through hell to get here. She wasn't turning back now. "Give me 2 minutes to reach the alcove," Abigail commanded, her voice terrifyingly calm as she unholstered her sidearm. "Then you light them up." The wind howled like a dying animal, whipping coarse sand into Abigail's eyes despite her tactical goggles. She crouched behind a rusted excavator tread, her heart hammering a frantic, terrifying rhythm against her ribs. She tightened the straps of her heavy medical bag, her eyes locked on the shadowed alcove 60 yards across the jagged floor of the Soviet quarry. Down below, the beams of insurgent flashlights cut through the swirling brown dust, moving methodically toward the exact spot where Chief Petty Officer Nathan Miller was bleeding to death. 2 minutes are up," Sergeant Brody grunted over the hissing static of her earpiece. From his elevated overwatch position, the massive mechanic chambered a fresh magazine into his M4 rifle. "When I initiate contact, you run like the devil is on your heels, Prescott. Do not stop. Do not look back. 3, 2, 1, go." The world instantly erupted into blinding violence. Brody didn't just fire. He unleashed a furious, calculated barrage of suppressing fire directly into the center of the insurgent search party. The sharp, deafening crack of his rifle echoed off the quarry walls, instantly drawing every beam of light and every weapon away from the alcove and up toward the ridgeline. Shouts of panic and orders barked in Pashto pierced through the roar of the sandstorm. Abigail broke from her cover. She sprinted across the uneven terrain, her boots slipping on loose shale and rusted iron debris. Tracers lit up the bruised sky, overhead bright green streaks of enemy machine gun fire seeking Brody's position, answered by the rhythmic, disciplined flashes of his return fire. Dust kicked up violently in a straight line just 3 feet to her left as stray rounds chewed through the rocks. She didn't flinch. She kept her eyes locked on the dark opening in the rock wall. She dove into the alcove just as the skies opened up with another brutal gust of wind. The space was cramped, smelling of cordite, metallic blood, and sweat. In the deepest corner, half buried under a collapsed shelf of shale, was Nathan. He was unrecognizable from the immaculate, stoic SEAL who'd stood in her living room 3 years ago. His desert camouflage uniform was soaked black with blood. His face was a pale grayish-blue, the undeniable shadow of severe hypovolemia. His breathing was wet and ragged, a horrific sucking sound accompanying every desperate gasp. "Nathan," Abigail gasped, dropping to her knees and tearing open her medical pack. His eyes fluttered open. They were glassy, unfocused. He gripped a combat knife in his right hand, his muscles tensing weakly as she approached. "Hostiles," he wheezed, blood bubbling at the corner of his lips. "No, it's Abigail. Abigail Prescott. Daniel's sister," she said, her voice projecting a calm authority she absolutely did not feel. She grabbed his wrist, gently forcing the knife down. "I'm a trauma nurse. I've got you." A flicker of recognition passed through his fading eyes before they rolled backward. He was crashing. Abigail went to work with ruthless efficiency. She dragged her trauma shears down the center of his plate carrier and ripped his shirt open. The entry wound was high in his right chest, a massive cavity that was pulling air into his pleural space, crushing his lung and pushing his heart out of alignment. A tension pneumothorax. If she didn't act in seconds, his heart would stop. She grabbed a plastic Ashman chest seal from her kit, peeled off the backing, and slapped it directly over the sucking wound, sealing out the air. But the pressure inside was already too great. She reached blindly into her bag and retrieved a massive 14-gauge decompression needle. Finding the second intercostal space at his mid-clavicular line, she gripped the needle tightly. "Forgive me for this," she whispered, and drove the needle hard into his chest cavity. A sharp hiss of trapped air escaped, followed instantly by Nathan taking his first unobstructed, shuddering breath. His chest fell, the immediate pressure relieved. But the victory was momentary. The pool of blood beneath his shattered right leg was expanding rapidly. "Tourniquet," she muttered to herself, operating purely on muscle memory. She pulled the heavy nylon strap high and tight around his upper thigh, twisting the windlass rod until the arterial spurting finally ceased. She packed the deep, ragged exit wound with Quick-Clot combat gauze, shoving the chemically treated fabric deep into the muscle tissue to force coagulation. Outside the alcove, the firefight was intensifying. The heavy, rhythmic thud of a Dijkar anti-aircraft machine gun began to tear the ridgeline apart. Brody's return fire was becoming sporadic. He was being pinned down, and the insurgents were realizing there was only one shooter on the ridge. Abigail jammed an IV line into Nathan's bruised forearm, her hands covered in his blood. She hung a bag of O-negative from a jagged rock jutting from the wall and pushed a heavy dose of tranexamic acid into the line to stop his internal bleeding. "Come on, Nathan," she prayed, pressing 2 fingers to his carotid artery. The pulse was there, thready, weak, and terrifyingly fast. But there, "Prescott," Brody's voice crackled over the radio, heavy with exertion and pain. "They're flanking my position." I took a graze to the shoulder. "I can hold them off much longer. They're sending a squad down into the basin." Abigail drew the heavy sidearm Brody had given her. She racked the slide, placing herself between the unconscious SEAL and the opening of the cave. "Fall back to the MRAP, Sergeant. Save yourself." "Not happening, Doc," Brody laughed, a dark, grim sound over the comms. "We leave together, or we stay together. Get ready." The howling storm reached a deafening crescendo, plunging the quarry into an absolute suffocating darkness. Abigail knelt in the dirt, her hands trembling around the cold grip of the pistol. Over the wind, the crunch of boots on loose shale and guttural shouts signaled the advancing insurgents. Flashlight beams frantically swept the alcove's entrance. Abigail leveled her weapon. She was a healer, sworn to save lives, yet here she sat, prepared to take them. A shadow materialized in the entrance, a blinding beam pinning her in place. Abigail squeezed the trigger. The heavy recoil sent a shockwave up her arm, and the shadow crumpled with a sharp cry. More shouts erupted. A hail of bullets showered her with sharp shards of rock as she hurled herself over Nathan, shielding his broken body. Brody, there at the entrance. she screamed into her radio. "I see them," Brody roared. A blinding flash of a fragmentation grenade illuminated the darkness, shaking the quarry's foundations, followed by the frantic chatter of Brody's M4 as he abandoned his cover to draw their fire. But it wasn't enough. A towering insurgent stepped into the alcove, leveling a battered AK-47 directly at Abigail's chest. She closed her eyes. "I'm sorry, Daniel." Suddenly the ground vibrated violently. A deep, mechanical roar eclipsed the sandstorm. The insurgent whipped his head around, only to be thrown backward as a massive, blinding spotlight cut through the dust. The terrifying, rhythmic thud of a .50 caliber machine gun shredded the night. "Reith Actual, this is Goliath, Vanguard," a booming voice echoed from a vehicle-mounted loudspeaker. "Keep your heads down." 3 heavily armored strikers had breached the quarry. Caught entirely off guard by the quick reaction force, the surviving insurgents scattered into the blinding dust. Seconds later, 2 combat medics burst into the alcove. Tension pneumothorax decompressed. "Severed femoral, tourniquet applied," Abigail recited automatically, her adrenaline finally crashing as they loaded Nathan onto a litter. They pulled her into the back of a waiting striker. Sergeant Brody sat across from her, his left shoulder hastily bandaged and soaked in blood, but he was grinning. "Told you we'd leave together," he rasped. When the convoy smashed through the gates of FOB Griffin, Dr. the Aris was waiting. He took one look at her makeshift handiwork, nodded grimly, and rushed Nathan into surgery. Later that night, Captain Ross quietly informed her that her court-martial paperwork had inexplicably been lost in the storm. 3 days later, Nathan Miller woke up. He blinked through a haze of painkillers, wincing at the tubes in his chest. Sitting in a folding chair beside his bed was Abigail, looking remarkably peaceful. "You shouldn't have come," Nathan whispered, his voice trembling. "It was a suicide mission." Abigail reached out, resting her hand over his calloused fingers. She looked him in the eye, mirroring the exact expression he had worn in her living room 3 years prior. "My brother never left his team behind," she said softly. "And as long as I am breathing, I'll never let a good person die alone in the dirt." If you were moved by this incredible true story of loyalty, sacrifice, and the unbreakable bond of the battlefield, please hit the like button, share this video with your friends, and subscribe to our channel. Don't forget to ring the notification bell so you never miss our upcoming dramatic stories of real-life heroism. Your support helps us honor these unsung heroes. Leave a comment below with your thoughts.